following program contains unfiltered political discourse and opinions with which you may disagree. If that's not your thing, turn back now. Still here? Well, strap yourself in, folks, because you're about to get shell-shocked. Good morning, Bay Area. It is your favorite KZSU host, DJ Trump, living rent-free in your heads. It is 8 a.m. on Thursday on KZSU 90.1 FM. And here in the studio, I've got my good friend, Ben. So we're going to talk about some politics today, like we usually do, in case you were surprised.
Hello, Bay Area.
So, both of us are, we have some philosophical differences and some philosophical similarities, which are going to be the basis of today's conversation. He and I both identify as libertarians, although I'm much more of the right-leaning persuasion, and he is generally a man of the left. We say a lot of mean things about people on the left on this program, but if they're willing to come on and talk, and Ben is, he's a pretty good dude, we're going to try and keep this civil. As civil as it can be. But, I mean, if you want to throw some haymakers, also feel free. I don't want to discourage you. So, where would you like to begin? I think, would you be comfortable opening the discussion with where our conceptions of libertarianism might differ? Because I have some pretty strong ideas, obviously. I spout them regularly on this program, but I could start if you would prefer.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I think axiomatically, there are a couple of basic first principles that we need to establish that sort of drive the rest of my thinking. They're foundational. So among them would be that objective existence exists. I think that's sort of self-evident. I mean, something has to exist. And beyond that, we exist within this universe, and our state is conditional upon the state of the universe relative to ourselves. Like, if we live or die, that's not arbitrary. Our physical forms matter, and they manifest in a regular pattern in the universe. So there are rules to the universe that we can know and understand, and it is within our interest to try and understand them as best as we can. And it is better for us to be alive than to be dead. So, I mean, those are pretty basic, but going for them, there becomes one that's more politically immediately relevant, although I do think objectivity and truth are under attack these days. It's also important to note that I do believe that men own themselves first and foremost. You are your most basic form of property. I mean, I think part of that's a metaphysical statement, that people are in control of their own actions, because ownership is mostly a question of control. But on top of that, I think it's also a moral statement. We need to acknowledge that people do and should control themselves, and trying to impose our wills violently upon other people is not only, immoral and doomed to fail, but it goes almost against one of the basic principles of existence itself. And whenever you do that, you're going to get whacked in the head. So on top of yourself, you own your body, you own your thoughts, you own your speech. I mean, most of your rights are just a question of ownership. And you also own your time and your labor. And any material entity that is unclaimed that you have mixed with your labor, like if you take an unclaimed field, and this might be where we start to get into some of the disagreement territory, and you fence it off and you improve it, you mix your labor with the land, you now own that piece of land, for example. But if your neighbor takes something from nature and makes it a flute or something of his labor, and then you trade with one another, you own whatever has been voluntarily traded between people, and that founds the basis of property rights and a civil society. So I would put forward. Is there anything you disagree with there?
So basically, wait, is the mic on?
Oh, sorry. We had some technical difficulties. My good friend Ben, as a result of my action entirely, did not have his microphone turned on, and I apologize for that. So Ben, you can get your word in edgewise now.
All good. Hello, Bay Area. Basically, I agree with most of it. I don't really fully buy into the notion of an objective truth existing, but I don't think we really need to debate that to discuss libertarianism.
Maybe we don't need to at length, but I think that's pretty foundational. I guess this is something I think you're going to have a little bit of trouble getting out of. I think most people do. So don't look too harshly upon me for asking this question. But sorry about that, folks. We had some. If you don't believe in an objective existence, on what standard do you say that? Ben is back here with me.
Well, basically, what I believe is that,
as you're saying,
we can be almost completely positive about a lot of things in life. I don't think there's anything, but there's no way to fully, entirely prove it to ourselves. It's an interesting, it's an interesting thing to think about just for the sake of thought, but it's not really something that is necessarily beneficial to life. At least not in a way that I see. Maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that there are certain things, as I was saying, there's a lot of things in life that we can be like 99.99% sure about, that we can never make it to that 100%, but we live as if we know 100%, and that's fine, because it realistically probably is true, but it's just not really worth thinking about it. Does that make sense?
I mean, to some extent. I mean, I certainly endorse skepticism of all kinds. I think what you're talking about is sort of Bayesian logic, where you assume there's a possibility of Proposition 1, Proposition 2, and as you get more evidence, you start to weigh it in favor of Proposition 1, and then as that evidence piles up, you get closer and closer to 100% certainty, but you never know for 100% certainty.
Yeah.
So Proposition 2 may be true, but the odds are increasingly small. So, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that position, but I would put forth that the idea of there being something that is true and something that is false, independent of our perception of it, I mean, that seems pretty foundational.
I mean, it makes sense, but how do you know for sure that the logic you're using is correct? I mean, it's probably true.
I mean, without it, logic can't exist. I mean, that's sort of.
Well, how do you know that logic does exist?
I mean, sort of assumed a priori, but
yeah, it's something that you assume to live your life on, which I'm completely fine with doing that. It's just that I think that you can't be 100% sure about it, but you can live your life as if there are certain truths for sure that I agree with.
What about I think, therefore I am? That sounds like something that's pretty straightforward. I mean,
so yeah, I mean, it makes sense, but how do you know that the basic logic you're using in your brain is even reliable? There's no way to know for sure. I mean, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. I would definitely agree, but it's possible that you're just overlooking something that proves it to be wrong. But I mean, for most of those things, I just live my life, and I think everyone should, as if there are certain truths. But it's just an interesting thing to think about, in my opinion, that you can't fully be sure of anything.
I mean, I guess the thing is, if the universe isn't logically consistent, does it even really qualify as a universe? Because part of the way we define a universe is, by being bound by natural law. So if those laws aren't in operation, if the gravitational constant, for example, can be whatever it wants, or if something can exist in 1 second and cease to exist with no cause in the other, then are we even really dealing with any kind of reality? Does existence exist? Does the word existence have any meaning? But I agree it's a philosophical, the interesting conversation that I would encourage everyone to think about, but we might be going off on a bit of a tangent, interesting one. An interesting one, nevertheless. So where would you like to take it from here, and more immediately relevant to our political worldviews?
Yeah, back to libertarianism. I agree that everyone should decide what's best for themselves, you own your own body and everything like that. And I also like that you said own your own labor, but I guess we have different ways of seeing that, because that's what makes me a socialist, is that you own your own labor, meaning the fruits of your labor are yours, and you get to keep them, and the CEO or the boss or whatever doesn't extract your surplus value and take it for themselves.
Okay, well, I would dispute to some extent the labor theory of value, the idea that the management or the capital owners are primarily exploiting labor and taking a surplus. I think that they're usually coming together for mutual benefit. Let's take this example of sort of a highly simplified state of nature, where you and I are living side by side in the woods. Mm-hmm. So let's say I am an old, feeble man, but I happen to have mixed my labor with some land estate, and you are a young man. You don't have as large of a farm as I do. You have a farm, and you're a pretty good farmer. So I'm old. I suck at farming, but I have some surplus. So if I come to you and say, hey, you've got some excess time, if you're willing to take this field that I have sowed and these plans that I have made and carry them out for me, I'm willing to pay you, to do so. I'll trade my money for your time. So essentially what you're doing in sort of a marketplace, especially when you're acting as a laborer, is you're selling your labor. So you own it, but that means by owning it that you're able to, offer it up to others and trade. And you're only trading some of your labor, usually for a certain amount of time or for a certain number of tasks that are completed. So the other person is not exploiting you. They have other opportunities that they can offer you. They can offer you new places to work or new tools. Maybe the older man, his body isn't what it used to be, but he has better equipment than you do. So he's already bought the equipment. He's set all this in motion, and he's paying you to help run it, so to speak. So, he's contributing a lot. He's giving you better tools. He's giving you access to this whole new area that you wouldn't have had access to before.
Yeah, so I definitely understand the argument. It's just that I think in today's society, there aren't really any viable options other than working for some sort of corporation. And for example, there's people that are very hardworking people that still can't really get by because maybe they work 3 jobs and they're all really low minimum wage jobs and they still can't really get by. That is because of this economic system that we have today. And just to clarify, I identify as like a brand of libertarian socialist. That's kind of like
the European libertarians.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, there are more specific ideologies than that, but for the sake of this, let's just say I'm a libertarian socialist. And so I would be perfectly okay with people choosing to live under some sort of capitalist system, or I don't know, like maybe free market or something. I'm not going to force anyone to live in socialism because that's authoritarian. But I personally prefer, so the libertarian refers to that, meaning that I will let people live however they want, do whatever they want with their labor. But the socialist part refers to the fact that I think socialism is a superior way to organize, and that's certainly, I would choose to live in a socialist society if I was given the choice.
All right. I mean, I would say that socialism goes against all the bases of human nature, and it would be an absolutely horrible society to live in. I would never want to live in a commune. I would probably shoot myself first. So, I mean, we have different perspectives, but at the same time, if you want to voluntarily migrate to a commune where people organize themselves, like maybe some sort of worker co-op, if workers are willing to organize themselves in such a way and they're able to, buy the rules of property, get their own capital together, and run that organization as they wish, I really have no way of stopping them or no moral issue to do so. I think that it's going to be competitively inefficient. I happen to be very skeptical of just communes being successful. But if they want to try it, I don't want to. I don't believe in using force to get rid of such things.
Okay, well, so that's good at least. That makes you better than most politicians in America. But basically, so I think I should define socialism before I go any further. Socialism basically means when the workers of any industry control its means of production, distribution, and exchange, and they democratically manage their own workplace. And there's no hierarchy in the workplace, except there may be a manager, but the workers hire this manager, and they can fire him. And so he really works for the workers. And there's different forms of leftism. So you can have like a commune with no money, or you can have socialism when there still is money.
I mean, socialism, for clarification, refers to a very broad spectrum of leftist thought that has gone back, at least since the 1800s, perhaps earlier than that. I mean, it can go all the way back to Plato's Republic if you want to read it a certain way. But the idea is that usually, there's sort of two species. One species, the thing that they have in common is that there's a conception of a popular ownership of the means of production and exchange. That's the common thread. Although who exactly represents the people in all these various schemes, be it a syndicate, be it a socialist vanguard party, be it the elders of the community or the sons of the philosopher kings who would make all the decisions, like that varies from socialist philosopher to socialist philosopher and socialist to socialist. But at the end, the sort of communal ownership, I think, is the primary keystone by which socialism as an ideology is held together. Would you dispute that?
Yeah, I pretty much agree.
Although
I don't really, when people say that the state owning the means of production counts as socialism, I know that some tankies may say that, but I don't believe that personally.
It was a tankie?
A tankie is kind of slang for an authoritarian leftist. Or
so we're talking like Stalinists or Maoists?
Yeah,
Trotskyites?
Marxist, Leninists. Well, Trotskyist is kind of like borderline. That's like maybe tanky, maybe not. I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah. So what I personally believe is that people should only have ownership of things that affect them directly. So workers should own the means of their company and make the decisions that affect them. But if a decision affects the entire community, like the way one workplace does something, I believe that everyone in the community should have some sort of say in that. Although, with that said, one thing that I strongly believe in is building strong communities, so people aren't going to make decisions that will negatively affect everyone else because they'll feel the social ramifications of it.
Okay, so I want to make this, because this sounds like it might be an interesting point of clarification. So do you believe people have the right to put whatever they want in their bodies and do whatever they want with their free time?
As long as it doesn't infringe on someone else's rights.
Okay, exactly. So now this is sort of where I want to see where you delineate, because suppose you have a young man who wants to, I don't know, smoke weed or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, that affects his community in many ways. If you believe solely in, like, he has a right to do it because it's his body and he can do whatever he owns it, then you could make that as a defensible position. But you could also then say, well, look, he's not spending time with his family. He's not going to work as much. He's not being nearly as productive. Also just the smell is unpleasant. We all have to walk past it and deal with it. So the community might come together and tell him he's not allowed to do that because it's having a negative effect on the community. So would you agree with that interpretation?
Well, I think that one thing that you see as you form strong communities is that people tend to not make decisions that affect everyone else negatively just because they don't want to deal with the social ramifications of it. Of course, there's going to be some exceptions.
Okay, so social pressure. I mean, we both believe in social pressure then.
Yeah. I think that's necessary for this.
I also believe that some people need to be able to go against social pressure because that's part of the way we make progress. If everybody did what society expected them to do, we wouldn't have any new startups or we wouldn't have any grand adventures or... a lot of our creative people wouldn't be employed in the same way they are now because those are high-risk gambits that don't always work out, and very often it's for your own passion and your own desire to build something that you do it, not because it's what the community wants or even what the community necessarily benefits from in the short term, even though in the long term the community tends to even be enriched by such things.
Yeah, so I think that if someone wants to go against social pressure and they have a good reason for it, then everyone else will hear of what they're doing and it'll kind of catch fire, I guess. And if the idea is any good, people will hear it out and say, yeah, I think that's how we should be doing things from now on. And then they'll continue to change their society in that way.
Okay, so I understand that, but at the same time, I'm sort of curious, what is the enforcement mechanism for somebody who's going against the community if they are not willing to listen to social pressure and if their idea doesn't win over the community in a certain period of time?
So I think it's important to understand that this is, at this point, going to be a very small percentage of people that would get to this point. But if you do...
So how do you answer the authority problem without having a centralized state?
So with all the social pressure and everything, if the person just continues to... literally no one's going to like them at this point. So if you like the people... I don't really think that someone could live their life this way if they're just... because they would get completely socially outcasted and like they try to go into a restaurant or something to get something and everyone knows each other. So everyone is just like, oh, you're the one guy who's just, I don't know, fill in the blank.
You're the one guy who plays his death metal music at 2 a.m. and keeps me up.
Yeah. So I don't know what, it would be a very interesting type of person that would, I guess maybe someone had mental health problems.
Not the mental health problems. I'm very mentally well. Please don't call anyone. Oh, God. What am I doing with my life? Broadcasting this sorts of thing on the air. But,
oh, boy.
I meant more like the individualistic, I don't care what people tell me to do, I'm going to do it. I'm DJ Trump in the Bay Area. I think I might be one of your rare birds.
Yeah, in this society, I think that mindset is definitely a lot more common. But when we start building strong communities, everyone understands that they have a certain role, and in order for everything to work correctly, you need to at least... There's certain things that you shouldn't do. It's not going to be... there's definitely going to be a lot less rules than now. And I'm not even going to say they're necessarily rules. It's just things that you generally know you shouldn't do. And of course, there's a spectrum for that. There's a few things that maybe affect a few people very mildly, I don't know, the smell of a weed, for example, that people will probably just overlook. But if it's something that's really big, then most people wouldn't do it because everyone would just start to hate them. And
we already have cancel culture. We already have cancel culture now. What you're describing seems to be cancel culture turned up to 11, being, the primary mode of enforcement of social norms, which is something we're moving towards already. But at the same time, there are problems that come with that because in the court of public opinion, you often don't have very good due process or due process at all. So you could be convicted of something. Let's take a rape allegation. In our system, we would take it to the courts, and we would try and hear from both sides. And if the man is found guilty, we would punish him very severely. We would put him in prison. But if the man is found innocent, or at least found not guilty, which we assume with the presumption of innocence is equivalent to innocence, he doesn't get punished. But under your system, it seemed to me that the allegation of wrongdoing in some situations, particularly where it's difficult to prove who's guilty and who's not guilty, might be enough to destroy people.
Well, okay, so I think a lot of the reason we have cancel culture today is because the government doesn't look out for the needs of the people, and the government is not very popular, and basically just existing power institutions right now do not reflect the needs of the people, and they just aren't widely popular at all. But I do believe that in this sort of society where you have strong communities and not much, if any, hierarchy, and people are a lot more free to do what they want, and you have deep connections with everyone in your community, that people would not really want to change that because most of the things that you want to do, you're allowed to do. I guarantee a lot of the reason now for cancel culture is because there's things that people want to do that seem harmless that for whatever reason are illegal. Maybe certain drugs, I don't know, psychedelics, weed in some states, and things like that are all factors that lead to people wanting to rebel against the system. But in my sort of ideal society, where you're much more free to do whatever you want, and again, you have strong connections with everyone, I don't really believe that cancel culture would be as much of an issue because people wouldn't want to change the way things are.
Okay, so I agree with you on the legalizing of certain substances being closer to an ideal society, but I do want to push back a little bit on the idea of abolishing all hierarchies. I mean, what is your fundamental problem with hierarchies? And don't you think, like, because humans are not only inherently social, but it seems like they're also innately hierarchical. We organize ourselves into hierarchies, and they're very useful. So why don't you like them, and how would you get rid of them?
So there definitely have been societies that have existed and still do exist today without hierarchy. But to answer the question, I don't think it's right for any person to have power over any other person. And I think everyone can decide what's best for themselves to do.
So how are we defining power in this situation? Just because power can mean different things. It can mean I'm going to punch you in the face if you don't do what I tell you to, or I'm going to get armed men to do it for me, which is usually translated into political power, which I would agree is incredibly problematic. We should probably do away with it to whatever extent we can. However, there's also economic or social power. Like, let's say one person's more charismatic than another. If we're just going to define power as the ability to make other people do things. It's like there's going to be some people who are better speakers, who are more persuasive, or are going to be able to just convince people to do things. And that's going to form a sort of pseudo-hierarchy in and of itself. And then you get certain clubs, for example. Let's take the Socialist Club. Now, not everybody in the Socialist Club is of the same rank. They don't have all the same... Even if they're all comrades, they don't all contribute as much. There's sort of a hierarchy of competence, right? There are officers or pseudo-officers. I've never actually been to such a meeting, but I assume they have to operate a certain way. So... you don't just arbitrarily pick who's going to be the president of the Socialist Club. Presumably, there's somebody who cares a lot, who shows up a lot, and who's kind of persuasive and charismatic to whatever extent a socialist can be. And they win leadership, and people defer to their judgment. And so you're going to have natural hierarchies that emerge in almost anything human beings do, because human beings differ in their native talents, and they differ in their levels of interest and dedication to various causes. So the people who are the most talented, the people who are the most dedicated, are on the whole going to tend to assume leadership positions.
Okay, well, there are certainly some things that you can never get rid of, like people being more competent or more charismatic, for example. But there are definitely, I don't think that anyone should be able to coerce anyone else to do anything. And I also believe that when you have institutional hierarchies, not just if some social hierarchies naturally form, like people that are just smarter or whatever, like nothing you can really do about that, I guess. But if you're talking like political hierarchies or in the social system, I don't agree with it, because I believe that if you have like any sort of hierarchy or state at all, that it's pretty much a vehicle for corruption to manifest. Okay. And history has shown that states and governments always tend to get bigger and more powerful over time, because it's just people just want to have power. I think that's something that drives a lot of history and political change, is that people just want to keep their power.
The concentration of political power and the corruption of political power is a pretty major problem and a theme throughout history that we could talk about at length. But I do want to go back to this, because I want to delineate where exactly does a hierarchy go from unfortunate but acceptable in your eyes to intolerable. So let's take the example of people having different levels of talent. Let's say that you have a class of 20 kids and they're all in kindergarten. And one of the kids is a little bit better at math and science than the others. Mm-hmm. And then they all go through like the same level of public school education, but they get different levels of grades and they get different skills. You know, maybe some of them decide that they want to gather around the kumbaya circle, maybe smoke some puffs or drink, and then other guys staying home at night studying for the next test. Yeah. And this goes on for a couple of years, and he eventually gets some coding skills or whatever, and he decides to found a company. Mm-hmm. And let's assume there are going to be tons of different little stories like this in each of the classes. Certain people are going to save their money, whereas other people are going to spend it. So you're starting to get differentials in wealth, even if there's no earnings income. But some people would spend more of their time working, and some people are going to spend more of their time studying and learning more valuable things. So if somebody decides to go to medical school and become a doctor, or found a startup and it launches and becomes like $1 billion company, should they get paid the same amount of money as somebody who decided to stay back and work as like a janitor or a DJ one less successful than myself, who isn't making very much. Like, does the natural hierarchy that emerges from people's decision-making cause problems in your view? Like, is it a problem if one of them makes 6 figures and the other makes 4?
Well, okay, so just to clarify, there are certain... So socialism can have money in it, but I'm also sympathetic to the version of socialism that is communism, where money does not exist, class does not exist, wage labor does not exist, and another thing about communism is eventually the state is supposed to not exist.
I mean, that's a pretty major conceptual problem, given that you just pointed out that power tends to accumulate. So when you give absolute power to the dictatorship of the proletariat, the idea that it's going to sort of spontaneously evaporate.
Yeah, well, that would be like Marxism or something. I don't agree with that. I think that I don't agree with the idea of a transition state, because I think that basically whoever owns the state in that instance basically becomes the new bourgeoisie. So you can't have a dictatorship of the proletariat, because then they become the new ruling class. Because I don't. That's a form of authoritarian leftism that I don't like. But to get back to
that's something we both share. Authoritarian lefty tankies is what you call them. Yeah. Tankies can go roll over a landmine.
True. But let's see, what were you saying? Yeah, but to get back to that earlier point, I think that if obviously some people are just going to be smarter, and I mean this is acknowledged in every form of leftist theory that I've ever read or I've ever learned about. They've never claimed that people are always just going to be the same, but there is a classist component to a lot of these things, though, like IQ and just like how much you know is partially based on your class status. Because if people are born into richer families, then their parents, like one parent may have time to stay home, and during those like first 5 crucial developing years, they like talk to them more, play games with them more, teach them more about certain math things or whatever.
Right, but how did the discrepancy emerge in the first place is sort of the question. Because I agree that there's an important environmental component to IQ, and beyond IQ there are other things like conscientiousness and some level of luck that determine where you fall in the social spectrum.
Yeah.
But I don't know, how would you erase that entirely? Like,
you can't. You can pretty much equalize the environmental stuff. You can never do it fully. That's not like 100%, but you can get really close. And then you're still going to have the genetic stuff, but...
Once you acknowledge that there are genetic differences between individuals, and that's going to manifest in meaningful ways throughout the society.
Yeah, of course there are some genetic differences.
Okay, I mean, you're getting into hot water here, man.
I mean, it's just true.
I'm not saying it's not true. It's absolutely true.
There's environmental components to everything, there's genetic components to everything. And...
Right, but as you equalize the environment, the genetic components are going to maximize, simply because they're where the variance is now. Because you can equalize for the environment to some extent. We could dispute how much. I mean, a lot of the IQ stuff, for example, tends to be in the womb, and like conditions of the mother's body, which is very hard for a non-intrusive state to alter in any meaningful way. Like, how are you going to determine which parents have crack babies and which parents don't?
I mean, what do you mean? Like, how do you determine it?
No, I mean, like, what are you going to do to prevent some mothers from consuming intoxicating substances that are going to damage the fetus in development, or from having bad nutrition when they're... I guess it would depend on how much you're willing to intervene, but at the same time...
Well, okay.
I guess this is also kind of unrelated, because we both agree that there are these differences, and we both agree that there are some environmental ways to ameliorate them, but some of the environmental differences are much harder to get rid of.
Well, I believe that a lot of this, in my opinion, goes back to capitalism, because under capitalism, you think of yourself as an individual worker as opposed to part of a community in more like leftist ideas, more leftist systems. So I believe that in strong communities or communes in some cases, that people won't really have as much of a need to do like super hard drugs, or I don't know, maybe be a prostitute, or lots of things like that might not be the best choices to do. And because there's no reason to do them if you feel yourself as part of a community instead of an individual person, and you're connected and you have support.
Okay, so I mean, I'm also going to push back on the front of individualism. I think people are best conceptualized as individuals. I mean, we like being members of communities, but at the same time, we also regularly leave and shift communities, and our individual autonomy is more important. Like, as somebody who, as an individual, a philosophical individualist as well, but a personal individual, like, I would absolutely loathe any community I was forcibly attached to that I couldn't leave, or that especially.
Well, there's no force there. You can always leave and join a new one. It's just that.
like how closely attached do people have to be to these communities? So, and why are they the basis of the political system rather than the individuals?
Well, okay, it's kind of both in a way, because individuals always, of course, have their own rights and their own autonomy that you cannot take away, but the community is another important building block, in my opinion, just because of the strong connections, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay, but these are all voluntary connections.
Yeah. I would never force anyone. That undermines the whole point of libertarianism. I would never force anyone to be in a certain community. I would hope that they would see that this is a good way to associate and they would choose to do it voluntarily. And I think that how we reach that from where we are today is to get people better education and give them more options of ways to live. Because right now you don't really have as many options as we should.
All right, another thing then, in ways of worker compensation, I mean, many firms are quite generous in offering multiple avenues. Like, you could have somebody that goes for just the highest paying job that gives them the most cash. But there are a lot of other benefits that usually come with particularly high performing jobs, but jobs in general. It's like you could get some healthcare coverage in return for lower wages, or you could get lower wages in return for more time off, or lower wages in return for like any number of things, better working conditions. Like, money that goes from employer to employee doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of wages. And on top of that, many employers would probably take the deal of saving some money in return for giving the workers more of a say in the day-to-day decision-making of the company. But a lot of workers don't seem to really be pressuring for that because they like having the money instead. So,
well, they don't really understand that it's really an option, because we're not really. I went through my entire education system through high school, and I never once was fully explained different ways of running economic models.
And there's a lot of things that you don't learn in K through 12 education. And it's a pretty serious problem in general. I think that our public school system needs to be reworked pretty substantially.
It definitely does.
Preferably privatized. I mean, that's... but, like, we'll have that debate.
Yeah, well, I mean, my point is that people don't know that there are other ways of doing things than what there is right now. And that's because that's what the people that control the country don't want you to know about those ways, because they want to keep their power. And I remember when most people hear socialism, what they think is like no freedom or like USSR or whatever.
Because that's what's accurate.
Okay, if you say so. I would be interested in what part of that do you think is accurate?
I mean, the fact that every form of socialism that has manifested on Earth right now has led to human misery. It's killed 100 million people. I mean, like, when you have Bernie...
that was this, they admitted to making that number up. No, they admitted to really stretching it. And there are far more deaths caused by capitalism.
Okay, I mean, there are two things I want to point out. Number one, the numbers aren't entirely made. The 100 million comes from estimates of how many people are killed per country. And some of those can be highballed because we don't have great data. I mean, they killed so many people that they don't even know. Like, Stalin killed about 20 million people. Like, he didn't keep
I'm
records.
not defending Stalin.
I know, but like Mao Zedong, like, let's go regime by regime. He killed at least like 30 or 40 million people. The number could be high as 65 or 70 million. And that alone, if you put those two together, gets you pretty close to the 100 million figure. And that's not taking into account Pol Pot, who killed 23% of the Cambodian population.
Those regimes are more just authoritarian, because one of the definitions of communism is that there's no class, and eventually there's going to be no state at all. And Stalin and Mao definitely did not want to give up their power. They wanted to keep that power.
I mean, because they're the vanguards of the proletariat, then, don't you see? They were going to work. Well, they were part of the revolution. The revolution was continuing. They had to dispossess the bourgeoisie. Many of the people were killed, like the kulaks, for example. They were dispossessed and sent to Siberia to slowly freeze to death because they were marginally more successful as peasants than some of the people surrounding them. And they owned their own private farms for the most part. They had private stores of wealth, which were a threat to the centralized Soviet agriculture. So this was done in the name of socialism. This was done to further unify under the auspices of the state, but in the name of these collective groups. You know, it was done to further a socialist society.
That's another reason why I don't agree with the idea of a transition state.
Okay, I mean, I'm not denying that transition states and socialism have been incredibly brutal, but I do think that it's difficult to separate socialism from what has been its most common manifestation.
Well, there have been many libertarian socialist movements, and some that still exist today.
All right.
So,
would you like to elaborate? I mean, I do want to say that when like Bernie Sanders and the Democrats are running on socialism, I don't think they're running on voluntary worker communes that don't.
Okay, that I would definitely like to discuss in a second, because I think I have some interesting opinions on that. But first, just let me say that. Okay, so here's some examples of more like libertarian socialist communities. So there was the post-Civil War period in Spain, Catalonia. Hundreds of anarchist communities existed before they were
wiped out by the Stalinists. Yes.
Yeah. Well, no, that was okay. That was. I'm pretty sure that was the like fascists of Spain that did that. But
there was infighting within the socialist movement as well. I mean, I believe George Orwell wrote a pretty intriguing tract about that. He came to fight on behalf of the Republican faction, which in the Spanish context was essentially a socialist faction. And there were many subgroups. There were anarcho-syndicalists who set up shop in a couple parts of Spain.
Wait, I'm pretty sure Orwell was on the side of the anarcho-syndicalists. Wasn't he?
I believe he was. I'm saying that he was fighting on the side of the Republicans, which was the leftist government at the time, under which, like, the way we try and classify this now, obviously there are many different militia groups on both sides that ultimately came together. We conceptualize this as the Franco-fascists and the Republicans, who are the various leftist groups, which included the Stalinist forces and the syndicalist forces. So I'm speaking in broad terms here.
Yeah, and then, there was also the...
But there was infighting between them. It's like the Stalin-esque groups were taking control within the syndicates.
Yeah, that's why I don't like authoritarianism.
Okay, I don't like authoritarianism because it violates basic human rights.
Yeah, I should have said that's one of the reasons why.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, the fact that it's shafted one of your beloved political projects multiple times, is you might conceptualize it. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's the cause of failures of a lot of it. And another example of this is, in the Ukraine Free Territory, which was set up by this guy, Nestor Menko. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but they were conquered by the Red Army. I don't know how long they lasted exactly. And then there's also the Neo-Zapatismo movement, which is in the Chiapas province of Mexico, which is still going on. But unfortunately, they have to live in a constant state of war because the Mexican government doesn't really like them existing, even though they're just chilling, minding their own business, living. And
I mean, generally speaking, states don't like it when other states form within their borders. That's one of their things.
That's the main problem I have with the way we do things right now, is that you should be able to do that if you want. You should be able to form your own voluntary community.
I mean, I'll look more into it. I don't know much about the issue in Chiapas. I do know that it's an overwhelmingly native territory, insofar as it has a lot of people who are speaking native languages and are mostly native heritage. It also is one of the poorest parts of Mexico. They actually have immigration within Mexico. It's very interesting, where people from Chiapas and other parts of the far south will migrate further north to do certain types of labor, but many of them don't even speak Spanish. So sometimes they're actually confused with illegal immigrants in Mexico, because there are people from the neighboring countries who are also in a similar situation, and sometimes Chiapas citizens of Mexico will be deported to, I believe, Nicaragua and some of the other surrounding... Guatemala, for the most part.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, Chiapas, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on.
Yeah, and then another example is North Sentinel Island, which has existed for, I believe the communities have been there for hundreds, if not like thousands of years, and they're basically living in what's called anarcho-communism, where they don't have money, there's no hierarchy at all in the society, and they still exist because they violently reject any like person trying to contact them or join the community or anything. So
is this the group that killed a Christian missionary about a year back?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, they also have no immunity to almost any disease. Like they would be wrecked so fast by smallpox.
Yeah, it's probably part of the reason why they don't let anyone come.
I mean, I don't know if they're fully conscious of that. The thing is, they've not been fully contacted. I mean, we know that. They shoot down drones if we send them anywhere nearby. Like,
I see why they would, based on history of these American drones have done.
I mean, not even just American, just any international drones. I mean, it is an international policy to leave these people alone, because we figured out that spreading diseases is a pretty catastrophic way to kill indigenous people. We don't want to do that anymore, not even on accident.
Good thing there was an oil there, or we'd be right over there.
Yeah, probably, sadly enough. But, yeah, basically they're mostly barren islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean that we leave alone and allow the people to continue to live there. Although they don't... I can't say that they're particularly happy. I mean, I don't know one way or the other, but my guess would be no, because, I mean, the death rate by murder in primitive societies that we know of is about 1 in 10. So, I mean, that's something to think about. I mean, a lot of these communist societies are communalist, or however you want to describe it, because most communist theory holds the idea that all human societies were essentially egalitarian in the distant past. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate end goal is to get someone back to that. I mean, I would point out the fact that even in like primitive societies, there's usually a big man, and even if he doesn't have a nice hut, because there's just not much to be had in the ways of nice huts, usually there are individuals who get preferential treatment in terms of access to mating, or they get leadership roles within the community. So you still have, I think that's hierarchy within the animal kingdom goes back at least 200 million years. Are you familiar with Jordan Peterson and the lobsters? The fact that lobsters actually have the serotonin system in their neurology, which is associated with dominance and submissiveness, and also happiness, like emotional regulation to a large extent. It's actually really interesting. So you'll have two lobsters fight, and they'll be fighting for a particular piece of territory. And one of the lobsters will, of course, win. And that lobster will puff up, he will appear bigger, and his serotonin levels will rise. And the loser's serotonin levels will fall, he'll be more submissive, he'll leave the spot, and he'll be less likely to challenge people in the future.
Okay.
What's really interesting is that you can give the weaker lobster serotonin injections. Like you can inject it into their brain, or I don't know if they have a fully formed brain, but their neurological system, and they'll act as if they're dominant again. We've been able to do that, but that's essentially the same principle behind depression medication. Like people who have serotonin deficiencies, they'll be very depressed, they'll be very unlikely to try and do anything, and we can actually medicate for that. But the point of that example is that dominant submissive behavior goes back at least 200 million years. It's older than trees by some estimate. Okay. So that's not ever going away. But even accepting that a lot of really early human societies were somewhat egalitarian, nobody had anything, so everybody was in the same boat. But some of inequality just seems to be a product of progress. Some people are able, through technological or social innovation, to get more stuff. One of the general trends when we adopt societies, it seems to be more and more hierarchical as it advances. So how do you counteract that? Or what would you want to?
Okay, well, I have a lot of things to say about that. So, first of all, to go back to I'll get to that, I promise. But first, I just want to say that there have been also, besides the ones I mentioned, there have been a lot of other leftist or socialist, or libertarian socialists, I guess, movements or societies that have existed. A lot of them, the U.S. actually stopped. For example, in East Timor, there was a very egalitarian society there, and we funded Indonesia to go genocide them.
Okay, I do know that the genocide was pretty egregious, and that Indonesia had some territorial aspirations because they control West Timor, the rest of Timor. I can't speak to how involved the United States government was in that process. I imagine we may have been. That sounds.
We gave them a lot of money. I don't know the exact number, but we gave them a lot of their weapons that they used.
Okay, but you do that explicitly in order to allow them to conquer East Timor? Because this would have been during the middle of the Cold War when we were fighting communism and various associated movements across the world.
If you get Henry Kissinger on here, you could ask him. But
okay, I'll work on it.
But basically, my point is that many times throughout history since World War II, we have funded genocides and military coups and installed fascists, as long as they were anti-communist, just in the name of squashing leftist movements.
Fascist...
all throughout South America, Central America.
Okay, fascist is the question, because fascism refers to a specific ideology. There are a lot of authoritarian military strongmen in South America who we backed and who did atrocious things to their populations. I'm not denying any of that for a second. I do just want to throw out there that I don't know if they would be qualified as fascist or not. Maybe they would be. They're authoritarians, but many of them, I don't think, adopted a lot of the hyper-nationalist rhetoric, for example, or a lot of the ethnic creed, the idea that the state would be all
ethnic isn't a requirement for fascism, though. It can help, but you don't have to be racist to be a fascist.
It would depend on how we define that, of course, because the idea that there's an important nation, rather the collectivity of the nation over the individual or over the class. I think this is something that's going to be important. I do believe that fascists are properly considered to be on the left as well, because they do believe in being hyper-collectivist, but their order...
No, it's a different type of collectivism, though. It's
ethnic or national collectivism, sometimes manifesting in racial theory, like Nazi Germany, other times just manifesting in the idea of being Italian, like in fascists.
Okay, so the economic system that fascists generally use is corporatism. It's also sometimes called third positionism, which is economic center and very high authoritarian. It's not... I wouldn't really call it right or left. I do know that corporatism is a form of highly regulated capitalism that keeps economic and business interests in line with nations' interests. So it's not fair to call it really capitalism or leftism, and you can't say this. That's not a fair way to disparage the left by saying, oh, fascists are on the left too, because General Pinochet was on the right. He was the capitalist, and I'm not going to say, oh, all of capitalism is bad.
I'm not trying to pillory all of the left with this statement. Okay. I'm just trying to point out the fact. I also think corporatism is closer to communism than you would otherwise realize. It preserves a hierarchy and it preserves individual responsibility, but simultaneously, if we consider ownership to be a question of control, the government makes all the important decisions.
Yeah, but not the public. True socialism is always the public ownership. Government ownership is like kind of a vague. It's certainly not socialism. It's like
people
I've heard it called state capitalism.
I don't know if that. I don't like having capitalism associated with that. I mean,
yeah, it's kind of a misnomer.
But I mean, on top of that, the state is usually conceptualized as a representation of the public. How legitimate that is, you and I would both be on the idea of disputing very heavily. But the idea that the state represents the nation, of course, being the people, at least the selected group of people who are politically relevant to that state. I mean, that's the model conceptually that they organize themselves under. Whether or not they actually match that model is something that I think is a valuable discussion. But if they claim to represent the people, they claim to represent the Volk, and they make decisions in the name of the people, and I mean, how is that not a form of socialism? Because it's like a public ownership, just
because
the
people aren't making the decisions themselves. And again, that's democratic control of the workplace is only that's not even happening. But that's even if it was, that doesn't make it socialism. You also have to get the workers have to completely control the means of production, and they receive the profits of their own labor in forms of socialism that still have money. So there's many things that have to happen for it to fully be considered socialism. So if there's fascism or corporatism, I could see how you say like the government says they're making interests that they say they're making decisions that reflect what the workers want, but that's also what capitalists say. That's what CEOs say. They say, "Oh, we're making decisions. This is what the workers want," or like we're telling them how to run the workplace, and this is the best way to do it. Same thing the state does. It's just a different person doing it.
I mean, not exactly. Usually, like if an individual owns a business, they run the business according to their own personal interest, and the workers, I mean, they stick around if they like it or if they have nothing better. But it's usually, if there's any pretense of, oh, we're doing exactly what our workers would want, I don't think Jeff Bezos is particularly concerned with the opinions of the people in his warehouses when he makes decisions about Amazon.
He definitely isn't. He might say he is.
I mean, I know, but like, I don't think capitalism has the pretense. I mean, the idea is like, you work for me, I pay you for your time, I run the show. Like, it's what you would be suggesting in your sort of ideal system of worker co-ops, where people voluntarily get together and the workers run and own a corporation. I mean, that seems to be what you would like. I don't want to mischaracterize it.
It's one of the things I would like, yes.
But I mean, that would seem to more fit the stereotype, like of. Well, I mean, I guess that's sort of the problem. Then I guess I don't think it's fair if the government controls everything to say that private individuals own that property any longer. And there are a lot of things that are meaningful about capitalism that fascism snuffs out. So it's definitely not a capitalistic system. I think we can agree at least on that much. Whether or not it's socialist depends on whether or not you agree on the idea of the state legitimately representing the public and making decisions on its behalf. But I mean, at the same time, I don't think the state can ever do that. So, I mean, that might, by your model, short circuit that as a definition of socialism. But that has been the socialist approach time after time after time.
For some authoritarian socialists that I don't really think we're socialists. But anyway, you're saying
that's not real socialism.
Well, it depends. There's some forms of authoritarian socialism that can be if it's like, let's say that the government enforces worker co-ops, which I don't really think that's something that happens, but that's kind of an esoteric example. But okay, anyway, my point is that if you agree that the government cannot fully represent the people's wishes, then how could corporatism be socialism? If socialism is when the workers make their own decisions, they democratically control their workplace, and corporatism, I don't know, maybe there's some really far left version of it where the government. Well, maybe that is corporatism.
I mean, like, what if it's like the government determines who's going to be on the board of governors? I mean, we already have some people in the radical left talking about this. It's like you have to have a certain composition of your board that is dictated by the government, or you have a situation where the products they make are tailored to the interests of the government. Like you're about to go to war, so it's like you go to all of your iron-making corporations or all your car corporations and say, hey, guys, I know you're interested in making your own products, but here's the deal. We're going to war. You make janks now. You are tankies. That is your profession, and like that's not a free market any longer. Also, government deciding, certain firms are going to succeed, certain firms are going to fail, regardless of market incentives, regardless of whether they're going to perform well or not. We're going to pick winners and losers, and the winners are going to do what we say, or they won't be winners anymore, down to the last detail of the business. If you're going to set hours, you're going to set wages. Because like in fascist economies, all this did happen. They also absorbed the labor unions into the government. and there'd be an official party labor union, and the government would negotiate on their behalf. I mean, you could argue how well they did it.
Yeah, okay, well...
But, I mean, in principle, all the decisions are being made by the government for its benefit and the benefit of the people it supposedly represents. So you and I can point out and agree that, yeah, the government doesn't really represent the people in a meaningful way.
Exactly. That's why corporatism isn't socialism. And fascism isn't socialism, because the government doesn't accurately represent the people. And socialism is when the people decide, the worker decide what's best for them.
Well, I guess I don't think there's any political system that would accurately represent the whole of the public, other than, say, the free...
Self-management. You decide what you want for yourself, and if it affects other people, like in the workplace, the workers decide democratically.
So what you're saying is you support capitalism.
No, I don't. Capitalism is private ownership of the means of production.
I know, but at the same time, like, let's say, like, you control yourself, right?
Yeah, well, that's where that's why I'm a libertarian, because you control your own...
Right, so what happens if you accumulate some capital by controlling yourself and, say, deferring certain pleasures or by increasing your income stream, and then you invest that capital and you build a business? Do you no longer control that capital? Is that now in the collective sphere?
What do you mean? Like
if you have like a 401k or something and you invest it, do you own that 401k or do all the workers own that 401k?
Well, okay. So the difference between... So one thing that's important to understand for socialism is that private property, it doesn't really exist in far-left economic systems, which I agree with, but personal property does. Now, the difference is that private property is something that's used for exploitation, like like a workplace that you own and steal surplus value.
Like all those evil factories that give people jobs.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or land that you're renting to people. Personal property is like your house or your toothbrush or your basketball or whatever, like stuff that you use
on a daily basis.
Live on.
Okay.
Yeah, like so it's
like mutual use and necessity. I've heard some people.
Yeah, like
you own your house. I've heard some people who've made that argument in order to get rid of absentee land ownership. Like you own a piece of land if you live there and you work it, but you don't own it if you're renting that.
Yeah,
I guess why not though?
Well, part of the reason is that right now we have a system, and this is a result of capitalism, that we have 5 or 6 times the amount of unoccupied houses as homeless people. And they're still homeless.
Many of them are homeless because they have mental health issues, for example. Like, they're not able to accumulate enough wealth to, like, even make down payments on a mortgage or afford rent. I mean, it's not entirely on the fault of the system, the individuals. I mean, like, it's partially on the fault of the system. We could talk about the asylum situation and how we let loose a lot of people who used to be in care. And we can debate that as well. I think that's an interesting time. We're almost running out of time, though, so let's try and wrap up this discussion and then briefly move on to the Democratic candidates, if you want.
Yeah.
I'll give you, like, 1 more minute to summarize your position.
Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that we have a system where, as I said, 5 times as many unoccupied houses as homeless people. And to paraphrase Bernie Sanders, 90% of all new income goes to the top 1%, but top 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half. And I believe this is a result of a system that values profit over human happiness and life. And many other things result from this too, like climate change. I don't think that's ever going to stop until we have a system where it's not profitable to ruin the environment anymore. So that's 70% of carbon emissions come from 100 companies. So, I mean, I could go on about this for a while, but basically my point is that all these things are a result of this economic system. And I don't think people should have to live this way. I think that you had said the point about mental health is fair. Like, yeah, people are homeless because of mental health some of the time. I don't know, like, what percent of homeless people.
I don't know off the top of my head. It's a very large percentage.
Well, either way, I don't think there's a reason that they have to be homeless. We should have some sort of system where people don't have to live that way. And we know it's possible. We have the resources necessary. We have more than enough houses. We have enough food to feed the world as long as we have a better way of distributing it. And the reason why it isn't distributed is because we value profit over human life.
I mean, profit also acts as a market signal. I mean, if you have somebody who's doing very well, like let's say it's very profitable to sell houses, then somebody else is going to see that somebody's turning like $100,000 profit each house and say, wow, people really want houses. So they'll come into the market, they'll provide more houses, but as they start competing, profits will go down, and eventually you might get close to a break-even point, or people are providing houses might lose money, and that shows that the housing market is now saturated. So, I mean, prices, profits, and loss, they help direct economic actors to make wise decisions. I will say this. I want to switch very briefly to the Democrats who are running and your thoughts on them. We're going to have to keep this kind of quick. But I will say that since the introduction of capitalism, human productivity has shot up. And if you go country by country, it's mostly rule of law, respect for personal property, respect for private property that have been highly correlated with high levels of wealth that have kind of been inherently tied to democracy. Global poverty, if you ever look at a graph of it, it's been going down for the last 2 centuries. We used to have about 90% of the world below the global poverty level. Now it's 90% who are above it. Okay. So, and then I'm sorry to cut you off. We're just almost out of time, and I do want to hear your thoughts on the Democratic candidates. I know I'm getting the last word in, but I gave you like the first 40 words.
Half of the people are living paycheck to paycheck, so it's not just because productivity is going up. Wages are stagnant. They have been for a while. So
wages have actually been going up a couple percentage points in the last few years.
Maybe a little the Trump presidency. The average person isn't doing too well. So maybe we're productive. Maybe global poverty is going down, but we still have underworked people that are technically employed, but they can't afford what they want. And I saw some statistics. It was like 70% of Americans can't afford a $500 emergency, and it's like half are living paycheck to paycheck. So
we can talk about we'll talk about some of the reasons for that later. But anyway, in the meantime, who's your favorite candidate in the Democratic race? I think I probably can guess. Who's your least favorite? Who do you think's going to win?
All right, so my favorite, I'm sure you can guess, Bernie Sanders. I really like Mike Gravel, but some senator from Alaska, even further to the left of Bernie, debatably, but he was never really that popular, and the DNC screwed him. Didn't let him on the debate stage, even though he deserved it. And least favorite, I really don't like, what's that guy's name? Bloomberg. I really don't like what he's doing, where he's basically trying to buy support. So I really don't like him. But then also,
it's working out okay. Is that like 7% of the poll?
Yeah, I know it's working, but I think that's a sign that the system's corrupt. That you can just like throw money at it and get support.
I mean, he's getting advertisements. He was the mayor of New York. He's just selling himself really well.
Yeah,
well, I mean, I don't like Bloomberg either. I'm all in for DJ Trump.
I also don't like they're pretty much all of them are corrupt. Bernie is the least corrupt out of all the Democrats, but I would say he's still slightly corrupt. It kind of depends. It's kind of debatable, but I really don't like the corrupt ones, like, I don't know, like Buttigieg.
Okay, so in what ways are they corrupt? Do they take a lot of donor money? Like
so super PACs. Buttigieg takes like money from big oil. And
did you know that Bloomberg is financing his own campaign?
Yeah. So maybe Bloomberg may not be like. I don't know. He doesn't really have any reason to be corrupt because he has all the money he needs, and that's a big factor that drives corruption. But I still really don't respect a lot of his positions on things. Like he did he started stop and frisk. That was one of his things in New York when he was
violated the Fourth Amendment. Also instituted taxes on soda.
He banned big gulps, which is
a lot of
major authoritarian move.
Yeah, and I don't really like soda. I would recommend that you stop drinking it. If you drink it, it's like one of the best health decisions you could ever make. I made it about 4 years ago. Never looked back. Honestly, one of the top 10 decisions of my life. But you have to choose that.
But still, it's up to you, exactly.
If you want to make bad life decisions, that's your call. But with the power of the pulpit, will encourage you against that. So, Ben, thank you very much for your time. I hope Bernie doesn't win, because I disagree with you. I think he'd be terrible for the country. But it looks like he might be pulling ahead in Iowa. We'll see what happens. Thanks for coming in.
No problem.